Kneeling in the dark on the freezing concrete floor, Flora frantically pried open an 80-year-old military trunk, her shaking hands uncovering millions in uncirculated silver certificates. Above her, heavy boots creaked across the rotting floorboards as a rifle round was loudly chambered into a hunting rifle. Boyd Henderson stood right above her hidden hatch, convinced he was reclaiming his grandfather's stolen fortune from an empty cabin. He didn't realize the desperate, freezing girl he intended to murder was already holding the evidence of a historic $2.4 million mob heist that would put him in federal prison forever. The winter of 2018 in Missoula, Montana was unrelenting. For Flora Higgins, it wasn't just cold, it was a daily fight for survival. At 21, when most of her peers were stressing over college midterms or weekend plans, Flora was mapping out which 24-hour big box store parking lots had the most lenient security guards. After a devastating string of medical bills from her late mother's battle with cancer, Flora's waitressing wages simply couldn't keep the lights on. The eviction notice had been taped to her apartment door on a Tuesday. By Friday, everything she owned was crammed into the back seat of her sputtering Honda Civic. She was exhausted, hungry, and running out of time. The Civic's heater had given out 2 days prior, and with nighttime temperatures plummeting to single digits, Flora knew she couldn't survive another week in the car. She needed a miracle. What she got instead was a crumpled local newspaper left behind on a diner counter. Flora had been nursing a single cup of black coffee for 3 hours at a greasy spoon off Interstate 90, when her eyes fell upon the legal notices section. Ravalli County Delinquent Tax Land Auction. Most of the properties were vast tract CTs of ranch land, starting in the hundreds of thousands, or foreclosed homes with starting bids of 50 grand. But right at the bottom, practically hidden in the fine print, was an anomaly. Property ID 409B. Former U.S. Forest Service outpost, decommissioned 1974. Structure condemned. 0.5 acres. Minimum bid. Outstanding processing fee $10. $10. It was a joke. It had to be a typo. But Flora had exactly $14 in her checking account and nothing left to lose. The next morning, she walked into the Ravalli County Courthouse. The auction room was mostly filled with wealthy developers in Patagonia vests and local ranchers in Stetson hats. Flora, shivering in a threadbare thrift store coat, sat in the very back row. The auctioneer, a tired-looking man named Thomas Abernathy, droned through the high-ticket items. Millions of dollars exchanged hands. Flora's heart pounded in her throat as the list dwindled. Finally, Abernathy cleared his throat. Moving on to Lot 42, Property ID 409B, the old Bitterroot Ranger Station, up near Trapper Peak. The county inherited this after a zoning dispute in the late 80s. The structure is officially condemned. No running water, no grid connection. We are opening the bidding at $10 just to cover the paperwork. Do I have $10? Silence hung in the room. A few developers chuckled. Nobody wanted a half-acre of useless off-grid rock with a rotting cabin on it. It would cost more to demolish the structure than the land was worth. $10, Abernathy repeated, looking at his watch. Going once. Flora's hand shot up. It trembled, but she held it high. Abernathy blinked, adjusting his glasses. I have a bid for $10 in the back. Do I hear 15? The room didn't even turn to look at her. They were already packing their briefcases. Going twice. Sold for $10. When Flora signed the deed an hour later, the county clerk gave her a look of profound pity. "You know that place has been abandoned for 50 years, right, honey? The roof is probably caved in. The snow up there will swallow a car whole. Be careful." Flora didn't care. As she held the stamped piece of paper, a heavy, unexplainable warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't an apartment. It wasn't safe. But it was hers. The drive up to the station took 3 agonizing hours. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a rooted dirt logging trail that the Honda Civic protested against with every bump. The towering ponderosa pines of the Bitterroot National Forest closed in around her, filtering the pale winter sun into a gloomy twilight. When she finally pulled the car into a snow-drifted clearing, Flora killed the engine and stared through the frosted windshield. The ranger station was a terrifying sight. It was a squat, heavy, timber-framed cabin built into the side of a rocky hill. The windows had been boarded up decades ago, the wood now grey and splintering. Half of the front porch had collapsed under the weight of countless winters. But the main roof, reinforced with thick steel corrugated sheets, was miraculously still intact. Flora stepped out into the biting cold. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her boots in the snow. She walked up to the heavy oak front door. There was no lock, just a rusted latch. She pushed it open, wincing as the hinges. Claire's throat let out a bone-chilling shriek. Inside it was pitch black. Flora clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through thick, dancing dust mows. The main room was surprisingly dry. There was a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall, a rusted iron cot in the corner, and decades of scattered debris, old tin cans, rotting field manuals, and animal nests. It smelled of pine needles, dry rot, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Flora spent the next 2 hours securing the perimeter. She hauled her meager supplies inside, set up her sleeping bag on the iron cot, and managed to start a small fire in the hearth using broken floorboards and dead branches she found outside. As the flames flickered, casting long dancing shadows against the log walls, Flora finally felt a brief moment of peace. But as she walked across the room to fetch her water jug, her boot caught on something. She stumbled, shining her flashlight down at the floor. The linoleum was peeling away in thick, brittle flakes, but right in the center of the room, beneath the grime and dust, the floorboards didn't run parallel to the rest of the cabin. They formed a distinct square. Flora dropped to her knees. She pulled out her pocket-care knife and scraped away the decades of hardened dirt. The outline of a heavy wooden trap-door revealed itself. Her heart began to race. A basement in an off-grid ranger station. She wedged her knife into the seam and pried upwards. The wood groaned but didn't budge. She dug frantically, clearing the edge of the trapdoor until her blade hit solid metal. She brushed away the debris. Securing the trapdoor to the floor was a massive industrial-grade padlock bolted through a heavy iron hasp. It wasn't the kind of lock you used to keep animals out. It was the kind of lock you used to keep a dark, terrible secret buried forever. Sleep was impossible. Flora lay on the cot, the fire dying down to glowing embers, her eyes fixed on the square outline in the floorboards. The wind howled outside, rattling the corrugated roof, but all Flora could hear was the deafening silence of whatever lay beneath her. Why would the Forest Service heavily padlock a basement trap door from the outside and leave it to rot? As soon as the first grey light of dawn crept through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, Flora was up. She bundled herself in every layer of clothing she owned and ventured out into the freezing morning. Behind the main cabin sat the skeletal remains of a maintenance shed. She spent an hour digging through snow and collapsed timber until her gloved hands closed around the cold, rusted shaft of a 3/5 iron crowbar. Back inside the cabin, Flora stood over the trapdoor. She wedged the forked end of the crowbar under the heavy iron hasp. She took a deep breath, braced her boots against the floorboards, and threw all her meager weight into the iron bar. Nothing. The 80-year-old lock held firm. Flora screamed in frustration, a raw sound that echoed off the empty walls. She repositioned the crowbar, this time using a loose brick from the fireplace as a fulcrum. She jumped onto the end of the bar. Crack, and was like a gunshot. The rusted screws holding the hasp to the floorboards violently tore free, sending Flora tumbling backward into the dust. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The padlock, still attached to the broken hasp, lay uselessly to the side. Flora grabbed her flashlight, hooked her fingers into the iron ring of the trapdoor, and pulled. It was incredibly heavy, the wood swollen with age. But slowly, agonizingly, it swung open on screaming hinges. A blast of stale, freezing air rushed up from the dark, smelling of ozone, mildew, and earth. She shone the beam down. A steep, narrow set of concrete steps descended into absolute blackness. "Hello," Flora called out, feeling foolish the moment the word left her lips. Only a hollow echo replied. Taking a deep breath, she began her descent. The stairs were slick with moisture. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, windowless concrete bunker. It was shockingly well built, far too reinforced for a simple storage cellar. The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating wooden shelves lined with rows of shattered glass jars. But it was what sat in the center of the room that made Flora freeze. It was a military-style footlocker, painted olive drab, its corners reinforced with heavy brass. Unlike the padlock upstairs, this trunk wasn't locked. The latch was merely flipped down. Flora approached it slowly, feeling the overwhelming sensation that she was trespassing on a tomb. She knelt on the cold concrete, flipped the latch, and pushed the heavy lid open. The first thing she saw was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The leather was cracked and pale with age. Flora picked it up, her hands trembling. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, written in faded fountain pen ink. Property of Arthur Pendleton. Head Ranger, Outpost 42. October 14th, 1934. 1934. The heart of the Great Depression. Flora carefully turned the pages. They weren't forestry logs. They were dates, names, and massive numerical figures. Transfer to Spokane, $40,000. Redirect to Helena Route, $15,000. Underneath the ledger, filling the entire trunk, were stacks of tightly wrapped wax paper bundles. Flora set the flashlight down, her hands shaking violently now. She reached in and pulled out one of the bundles. She tore at the brittle wax paper. Green paper spilled into her lap. Flora gasped, dropping the bundle. She stared in shock. They were bills, but not modern currency. They were crisp, uncirculated 100-talon bills bearing seals she didn't recognize. She picked one up, bringing it close to the flashlight. It wasn't a standard Federal Reserve note. The text across the top read, "Silver Certificate." She frantically tore open another bundle. 50s, another hundreds. The trunk was packed to the brim. She was looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, hidden by a ranger in 1934. "I'm rich," she whispered into the dark, the words tasting completely foreign in her mouth. "I'm actually rich." Thud. The heavy sound of a footstep directly above her head snapped Flora out of her trance. She froze, the silver certificate slipping from her fingers. Someone was in the Clear's Throat cabin. Flora quickly killed her flashlight, plunging the bunker into pitch blackness. She held her breath, straining her ears. The floorboards above creaked ominously. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were pacing the perimeter of the room. "Hello?" A gruff, deep voice called out. It didn't sound friendly. It sounded angry. "I know someone's in here. Saw the damn tire tracks in the snow." Flora's mind raced. She was miles from civilization. No cell service. Trapped in a basement with a fortune in stolen Depression-era money. She felt around in the dark, her hand closing over the heavy shaft of her flashlight. It was her only weapon. She crept up the concrete stairs, agonizingly slow, until her eyes leveled with the top of the trapdoor. Standing in the center of her cabin was a massive man in a heavy Carhartt jacket and mud-caked boots. He had a thick, unkempt beard and was holding a heavy hunting rifle, the barrel pointed casually toward the floor. "Listen to me very carefully," the man barked, his voice echoing in the small cabin. "My name is Boyd Henderson. This land belongs to my family. My grandfather ran this ridge. The county had no right to auction it off, and I missed the damn gavel by 1 hour. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, finally locking on to the open trapdoor. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, you found Arthur's little hidey hole, didn't you?" Flora gripped the flashlight tighter, her knuckles turning white. Boyd stepped closer to the edge of the trapdoor, the barrel of his rifle lowering until it was pointed directly into the gloom where Flora crouched. "Come on up, little girl," Boyd sneered. "We need to have a talk about the rent and about what you just found in my grandfather's basement." Flora looked back down into the dark. She looked at the fortune that could save her life and the man standing between her and freedom. The $10 miracle had just turned into a nightmare. And Flora Higgins, a girl who had lost everything, realized she was going to have to fight like hell to keep her life. Flora crouched on the freezing concrete steps. The heavy beam of her tactical flashlight switched off, plunging the narrow stairwell into absolute blackness. Above her, Boyd Henderson's heavy boots groaned against the rotting floorboards. The metallic clack-clack of a round being chambered into his hunting rifle echoed through the small cabin like a thunderclap. "I know you can hear me," Boyd said, his voice dropping into a dangerous growly register. "My grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, was a smart man. He built this station. He dug that bunker with his own 2 hands. And he didn't die penniless in a nursing home just so some homeless kid from Missoula could walk away with his legacy. Bring the trunk up." Flora's mind was moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. In her left coat pocket, she still had the leather-bound ledger. In her right pocket were 2 tightly wrapped bundles of 1934 silver certificates, maybe 20,000 in total. But the trunk at the bottom of the stairs held a fortune. "I don't know what you're talking about," Flora shouted back, her voice shaking just enough to feign absolute panic, though a cold, calculated survival instinct was beginning to take over. "There's nothing down here but broken glass and dirt. The padlock was already broken when I got here." Boyd let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You're a bad liar. I saw the broken hasp. I saw your crowbar. Now I'm not going to ask you again. You carry those bundles up here, and maybe I let you walk back to that piece of trash Honda Civic and drive away." He was lying. Flora knew it with absolute certainty. You don't let a witness walk away when there are millions of dollars of untraceable depression, era cash on the line. If she walked up those stairs, he would shoot her and bury her in the very bunker she had just unsealed. Flora slowly retreated down the stairs, her boots making agonizingly soft scuffs against the concrete. She reached the bunker floor and turned her flashlight on its lowest, dimmest setting, keeping the beam pointed at the ground. She needed a weapon. She needed a distraction. Her eyes scanned the dusty wooden shelves lining the walls. Most of the glass jars had shat over the decades, their contents reduced to dried, unidentifiable black husks. But on the bottom shelf, sitting in a pool of dried wax, were 3 large intact mason jars filled with a clear yellowish liquid. Flora unscrewed the rusted lid of one. The smell hit her instantly, sharp, volatile, and overwhelmingly chemical. Turpentine. Arthur Pendleton had stored highly flammable solvents down here to thin the heavy oil paints used for the station's exterior. "I'm losing my patience," Boyd roared from above. The floorboards directly over Flora's head vibrated as he stomped his foot. "I'm counting to 3, and then I'm coming down there. 1. Flora, Clear's throat, grabbed 2 jars of turpentine. She silently crept back up the concrete stairs. 5 steps. 4 steps. 3. She stopped just below the lip of the trapdoor, hidden in the shadows. 2. Flora's thumb hovered over the power button of her heavy-duty flashlight. It was a high-end 1,000 lumen tactical model she had bought for living in her car, equipped with a blinding strobe function designed to disorient attackers. 3. Have it your way, little girl. Boyd's silhouette appeared in the opening of the trapdoor, blocking out the dim daylight of the cabin. He began to descend, his rifle leading the way. Flora didn't hesitate. She slammed her thumb onto the flashlight's button, aiming the lens directly into Boyd's face. A searing, rapid-fire burst of pure white light exploded in the stairwell. Boyd screamed, dropping his heavy jacket sleeve over his eyes as the strobe blinded him instantly. His finger jerked against the trigger. Bang! The rifle discharged, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet shattered the concrete wall inches from Flora's head, sending razor-sharp shrapnel slicing across her cheek. Ignoring the stinging pain, Flora hurled the first mason jar of turpentine directly at his chest. The heavy glass shattered against his jacket, dousing him in the foul-smelling chemical. Before he could recover, she threw the second jar at his boots. It smashed against the stairs, slicking the wet concrete with volatile oil. "You little Boyd," roared, swinging the rifle blindly. Flora didn't back down. She lunged forward. She drove her shoulder directly into his knees. Boyd, blinded by the strobe and slipping on the turpentine slicked stairs, lost his balance entirely. With a heavy, panicked shout, he tumbled backward. His massive frame crashed violently down the concrete steps, his head striking the floor of the bunker with a sickening thud. The rifle clattered into the darkness. Flora didn't wait to see if he was conscious. She scrambled up the remaining steps and threw herself into the main cabin. She grabbed the heavy wooden trapdoor and slammed it shut with a deafening crash. The HA hasp was broken. She couldn't padlock it. Panic rising in her throat, Flora looked wildly around the room, the rusted iron caught in the corner. She ran to it, her boots slipping on the dusty floorboards, and threw all her body weight against the frame. Metal shrieked against wood as she dragged the heavy bed across the room, wedging it directly over the trapdoor. Beneath her, a muffled groan drifted up through the floor. Boyd was waking up. Flora wasn't done. She ran to the massive stone fireplace and began hauling loose river stones, stacking them onto the iron cot to add agonizing weight. She piled rotting logs, her own supply crates, and anything else she could find. Thump! The trapdoor shuddered as Boyd slammed his shoulder against it from below. The iron cot groaned, but the sheer weight held the door in place. "Thump! Let me out of here!" Boyd screamed, his voice muffled, but terrifyingly violent. "I'll kill you! I swear to God, I'll kill you!" Flora grabbed her car keys from the table. Her cheek was bleeding freely. Her hands were shaking violently, and her lungs burned from the dust and adrenaline. She bolted out the front door of the cabin and into the freezing mountain air. The bitter winter wind hit Flora like a physical blow as she sprinted through the knee-deep snow toward her Honda Civic. The sky had darkened into a bruised purple, and heavy snowflakes were beginning to fall. A blizzard was rolling in. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her hands were trembling so violently, she dropped the keys into the footwell. She swore, blindly, digging around the frozen floor mats until her frozen fingers brushed the metal. Thump! Crash, the sound echoed off the mountainside. Flora looked through the snow-caked windshield. The front door of the cabin was shuddering. Boyd was awake, and he was furious, firing his rifle blindly through the trapdoor to shatter the floorboards. It was only a matter of time before he broke through the wood entirely. Flora jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine wailed. It sputtered, coughed, and died. "No, no, no, please," Flora begged, pumping the gas pedal. "Not today. Come on." She twisted the key again. The starter motor grounded agonizingly, fighting against the frigid oil and the deadening cold. Inside the cabin, a sharp, splintering sound rang out. He was breaking through. Flora slammed her fist against the steering wheel and held the ignition over. With a violent shudder and a cloud of black exhaust, the Civic's engine roared to life. She slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning wildly on the ice before finally catching traction on a patch of gravel. The car shot backward, narrowly missing a towering ponderosa pine. She threw it into drive and fled it. The descent down the mountain was a nightmare of sliding tires, sheer drop-offs, and blinding snow. Flora drove with a reckless desperation, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see Boyd's headlights cutting through the storm behind her. But the mountain road remained empty. She had tripped him long enough. It took 2 terrifying hours to reach the Missoula city limits. Flora didn't go back to her usual parking lot. She didn't go to a diner. She followed the signs straight to the imposing glass and steel building of the local FBI field office. When she burst through the double doors of the lobby, coated in dirt, smelling of turpentine with dried blood crusted on her cheek, the front desk agent immediately stood up and unholstered his sidearm. "I need to speak to someone in charge," Flora gasped, leaning heavily against the security desk. "I just bought a property, and I found something. Someone tried to kill me for it." Special Agent Gregory Miller was a seasoned investigator who had spent 2 decades dealing with sovereign citizens, rural drug rings, and local disputes. But as he sat in the stark interrogation room across from Flora, his professional stoicism completely fractured. Flora reached into her heavy coat and pulled out the cracked leather ledger, sliding it across the metal table. Then she pulled out the 2 tightly bound packages of uncirculated 1934 silver certificates and set them down next to it. "Property ID 409B, Flora said, her voice finally steady. "There's a man named Boyd Henderson trapped in a bunker under the floorboards, and there is a trunk down there with at least 2 million more of these." Agent Miller carefully opened the ledger. He read the first few entries, his eyes widening. He picked up one of the $100 bills, holding it up to the fluorescent light. "Where did you say you found this?" Miller asked, his voice hushed. "The old Bitterroot Ranger Station." Miller closed the ledger, a look of utter disbelief on his face. In 1934, an armored train carrying Federal Reserve transfers from Chicago to Seattle was robbed at gunpoint by a crew associated with the Chicago outfit. 2 million in silver certificates vanished. The FBI suspected a local Forest Service ranger had aided in hiding the stash, but they never found the money. The ranger disappeared. Flora stared at him. Arthur Pendleton. He was the bagman. Miller whispered. He hid the money and let the mob tear itself apart looking for it. And his grandson must have spent his whole life trying to find the property. Within an hour, a heavily armed tactical team of FBI agents and state troopers was mobilizing up the mountain. By the time they reached the cabin, Boyd Henderson had managed to hack his way through the splintered trapdoor, but he hadn't made it far. Half blinded by the strobe and freezing in his turpentine-soaked clothes, he was arrested walking down the logging road, the antique rifle slung over his shoulder. Down in the bunker, federal agents recovered the olive-drab footlocker. Inside was $2.44 million in pristine, uncirculated Depression-era currency. It was the largest recovery of stolen historical bank funds in Montana's history. Because the money was the product of a federal robbery, it legally belonged to the U.S. Treasury. But Flora Higgins was no longer the desperate, unhoused 21-year-old girl praying for a miracle. She hired one of the best property lawyers in the state on contingency. Under the specific statutes governing the recovery of historical artifacts and federal reward structures for the return of stolen currency, Flora filed a massive claim. The legal battle took 6 months, but the government, eager to close an 80-year-old cold case and avoid a media circus, settled. Flora was awarded a 15% finder's fee of the recovered face value, plus a historical preservation buyout for the land, which the county had illegally auctioned without conducting a proper historical survey. Flora walked out of the federal courthouse with a check for $410,000. She didn't buy a mansion, and she didn't buy sports cars. She bought a small, warm, 2-bedroom house in a quiet Missoula neighborhood. She paid for her first semester of college in cash, and on a freezing Tuesday in December, exactly 1 year after she was evicted, she sold the sputtering 1998 Honda Civic to a local scrapyard. As she watched the tow truck haul the car away, Flora touched the faint silver scar on her cheek. She had risked everything for a $10 piece of useless rock, and in return, the mountain had given her exactly what she fought for: a future. Flora's terrifying fight for survival turned her $10 gamble into a multi-million-dollar triumph, proving that sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way to find buried treasure. If this incredible true story of survival, history, and shocking twists kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share Flora's journey with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable, real-life mysteries that will leave you absolutely speechless. This